Shays versus Whiskey Rebellion. The Shays Rebellion took place from 1786 to 1787. The Shays Rebellion was caused because the American public was unhappy and believed they were being misrepresented by the federal government. When Revolutionary War veterans would return home, they faced a lot of debt. This is because when they left their families to go to war, their families had to barter and trade with merchants for goods. But merchants only wanted money, not goods. Many of these veterans and their families were farmers, and they were only accustomed to bartering rather than using currency. This is because of the Articles of Confederation, which didn't give the federal government the power to tax, regulate currency, or mobilize troops. So these families would accumulate a lot of debt during the war. And the only way they could pay back this debt was through money that the soldiers earned and were owed from the government during the war. But because the government had no power to tax, they could never pay back these veterans. So when the courts started knocking on their door, pressuring these families to pay their debt or they would face jail time, the veterans became very angry and began to riot. The key concept of this rebellion is that the federal government was weak and could do nothing to prevent or stop the uprising once it started. It was actually the merchants that hired a private army to stop the riots. The Whiskey Rebellion took place from 1791 to 1794. The cause of this rebellion was the federal government implementing a tax on whiskey. The regular American distillery that produced whiskey was at a disadvantage. There were two ways you could pay off this tax. You could pay it per barrel or a large flat rate per year that would save you money per barrel in the long run. But only large merchants could afford to pay this flat rate, and the small producers of whiskey could now not afford to produce any whiskey at all. The Mingo Creek Association was formed in adamant opposition of the tax, and they acted like a kind of mafia and would stop all distillers from paying this tax. But a year after the Shays Rebellion, the federal constitution was passed, which gave the federal government much more power, and under the supremacy clause in the constitution, the government can enforce federal law with force. So when the Mingo Creek Association would torture and stop these tax collectors from doing their job, Washington and federal troops came in and swiftly ended the rebellion. The big difference between these two rebellions was the strength of the federal government and their ability to respond to crisis. The Shays Rebellion was met by a weak federal government and showed that a stronger federal government was needed. And the Whiskey Rebellion demonstrated how a strong federal government was needed.
The next comparison we'll be doing is with Bacon's Rebellion and the Great Southwest Railroad Strike. Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon led indentured slaves and backcountry farmers into a rebellion against the Virginia governor, William Berkeley, because they felt like they were not being protected fairly against the Native Americans. After the uprising, the government easily suppressed the rebels. The Great Southwest Railroad Strike. Jay Gould, owner of a large railroad company stretching around most of the West, was a ruthless baron who only cared about his profit. As a result, the Knights of Labor decided it was time to strike across 5 states to show that railroad workers were tired of unsafe work conditions and low wages. The strike failed and violence broke out. Railroad cars were destroyed and sabotaged, and because of this, Gould called in the government for military help. The strike was again crushed and ended the Knights of Labor's hopes to receive fair compensations and conditions for workers. Both of these events had to do with people feeling that they were not treated properly, and as a result they ended in either a strike or a rebellion. These events helped show that strong corporations or organizations can easily suppress little uprisings with their powers. The indentured slaves went back to work with less rights, and the people who went on strikes lost their jobs to people who would work for less.
The Stoner Rebellion vs. the Vesey Rebellion. The Stoner Rebellion took place in 1739 in South Carolina. It was the largest slave rebellion in the British colonies. 21 whites and 44 blacks were killed. The rebellion was led by a literate slave named Cato, who began the march south from the Stono River. An immediate effect of this rebellion was the Negro Slave Act of 1740, which prohibited slaves to move abroad, assemble in groups, raise food, earn money, or to learn and write English. The Vesey Rebellion, which took place in 1821, also in South Carolina, was led by a freedman named Denmark Vesey. Vesey was also illiterate and bought his own freedom when he won the East Bay Lottery in 1799. The Vesey Rebellion consisted of 3,000 participants. However, the plan was foiled when 2 members of the rebellion plot were caught by local officials. Vesey and 35 others were hanged. The effect of the Vesey Rebellion was that life became far worse for the black population of South Carolina. In a panic, the state assembly passed strict new laws limiting the new movements of slaves and preventing free blacks from entering the ports. Both of these rebellions negatively affected the blacks because it made for even harsher restrictions of the slave population.
The Pueblo versus Pontiac Revolt. They were both rebellions by the native people against people who were occupying their land and mistreating them. The Pueblo Revolt started in 1680. The conflict arose in present-day New Mexico and Arizona. There were about 2,000 Spanish ruling about 30,000 native Pueblo Indians. They got along until the Spanish priests in power started suppressing the native traditions and tried to force Christianity upon them. The Spanish also began to demand tribute and forced labor under harsh conditions. A native religious leader, Pope A, united the people in a revolution that killed hundreds of Spanish, almost cutting their numbers in half. The Spanish were forced to flee. By the end of the century, after a bloody recolonization effort, the Spanish had worked their way back into control. But as a result for the Pueblos, it was not bad at all. After the revolt, the Spanish respected them more and gave the Pueblos more freedoms. They did not try to force the natives into Christianity and allowed them to continue to practice many of their traditions. Pontiac's rebellion took place from 1762 to 1766. The British colonies believed that they were better than the natives. The colonists never honored their promises to keep off of the natives' land. There was peace at first between the Indians and settlers, but after the British won the 7-Year War, the colonists began to push for more land and began to encroach upon the Indian land. An Indian leader named Pontiac united the tribes such as the Ottawas. They went on a rampage and started capturing settlers' outposts and killing many of them. After their eventual defeat, the British Crown tried to extend more protections and rights towards them. An example of this is the Proclamation Line of 1763. When the native people were treated unfairly, or when the traditions were suppressed, they went nowhere. This is a continuity you can see throughout time. And after it was over, the government tried to extend them more rights to keep from having further conflict arise.
Next, we will be contrasting the Zoot Suit riots and the LA Street riots. The Zoot Suit consisted of a broad-shouldered draped jacket, balloon-like trousers, and sometimes a flamboyant hat. Mexican and Mexican-American youths who wore these outfits were called Zoot Suiters. It all started when Mexicans came to the U.S. for agricultural jobs in World War II. There was lots of racial tensions between whites and Mexicans. The Sleepy Lagoon murder did not help. A party-goer was murdered supposedly by a Zoot Suiter, and the media portrayed them as gang members. Eventually, the murder charges were overturned. Upset by the verdict, a group of sailors claimed that the Zoot Suiters had attacked them, so servicemen started to do vigilante work against the Zoot Suiters. These servicemen were looked as heroes in the public's eyes. Because of this, riots broke out and more Zoot Suiters were arrested than servicemen. The LA Street riots started when an unarmed black man, Rodney King, was brutally beaten by local LA police. However, the cops were acquitted for their crimes. Violence first erupted at the intersection of Florence Boulevard and Normandy Avenue in South Central Los Angeles. Traffic was blocked and rioters beat dozens of motorists, including Reginald Denny, a white truck driver who was dragged out of his truck and nearly beaten to death by 3 African American men. California Governor Pete Wilson deployed the National Guard at the request of Mayor Tom Bradley, and a curfew was declared. By morning, hundreds of fires were burning across the city, more than a dozen people had been killed,